Hello, my name is Ashley Biggers. I'm your presenter today for the Albuquerque Historical Society meeting on June 21st, 2020. I'm joining you today via Zoom because we are in the midst of a global pandemic. And so we are meeting via Zoom and via Facebook Live as we navigate the COVID-19 safety practices. So just a little bit of housekeeping today. If you'd like to rewatch this session later, you can always head to the Albuquerque Historical Society website, where you can see this session as well as all the archived sessions from previous presentations. I'll be talking with you about 45 minutes today, and then at the end of the session, if you have any questions, you're welcome to share them with me just in the comment section below where you're watching this video on Facebook Live. And through the magic of technology, I will be able to answer those for you. So I am coming to you today to talk with you a little bit about my book, Secret Albuquerque, A Guide to the Weird, Wonderful, and Obscure. So first, a little bit of background about myself. I'm an award-winning writer and editor who has grown up in Albuquerque and is now back writing about it as a professional journalist. My work has appeared in places like CNN and USA Today 10 Best, Afar, Lonely Planet, Photos Travel, and local favorites like New Mexico Magazine and Albuquerque the Magazine. I'm also the author of 100 Things to Do in Albuquerque Before You Die, as well as Eco Travel New Mexico. So as you can tell, I'm primarily a travel writer. And in this era of COVID-19, I'm not doing much traveling. I'm going places like the grocery store and my backyard. So all of that has reminded me that travel is absolutely a privilege, and it's a privilege both financially and in terms of being able to know that we are safe as we move about the world. But that those reminders also mean that it's been a great chance to rediscover my hometown. And I hope that this time is an invitation to all of you to rediscover your hometown of Albuquerque as well. I encourage you to adopt that sense of travel. As you move about Albuquerque, we can cultivate that sense of discovery and learning and just educating ourselves about other cultures, even in our hometowns, whether that means going to a different restaurant or Googling why that historical marker is on the building at the end of our block. So this is a great opportunity to do all of that. And one of the great ways to do that is to use Secret Albuquerque to guide your way. So Secret Albuquerque is actually part of a national series through my publisher, Reedy Press. There are companion titles either out now or being written for cities all across the United States, from Los Angeles to New York. And they are really guides to cities often overlooked, offbeat, and unknown destinations. So this edition features about 90 different items to see, do, and experience in Albuquerque. I'll be talking with you today about 17 of them. Of course, given that I'm sharing with you all in the society, I have chosen more of the historical items from the book, but there are many more to discover. And I'll share with you as well that the book came about as sort of outtakes from my first book, 100 Things to Do in Albuquerque Before You Die. So as I was creating that list, I actually came up with a list closer to 200 of things to do and see in the city. But some of those items were just a little bit too odd for that sort of introductory guide, but they became perfect fodder for Secret Albuquerque. So kicking things off, one of the first items that I will share with you about is the Painted Lady Bed and Brew. So this is a historic building in the Wells Park neighborhood. It was actually built in 1881, and it first started appearing on maps for the city of Albuquerque about 1900. And by 1904, we know that it was operating as the Swastika Saloon with a wine room in connection. And a wine room in connection was code to those in the know that a brothel was operating on site. And of course, we in the Southwest know that the swastika has very different connotations for us and the indigenous peoples in this area. So it references the southwestern connotations of the swastika, not those that were later on appropriated by other groups. So as I mentioned, the Painted Lady building is located in the Wells Park neighborhood, and it sits just across the street from the American Lumber Company. And we estimate that around the turn of the century, when it first began operating, the population in Albuquerque was about 5 men to every 1 woman. So we know that the brothel business was going quite well. Prostitution was actually legal in Albuquerque until 1914. However, it's believed that the property continued to operate as a brothel and well past that date, even when it was operating as Charlie's Grocery in the 1970s. So Jesse Heron, who is the owner of Albuquerque Tourism and Sightseeing Factory, purchased the building in 2014 and set about restoring it. And he's done so in a way that keeps as many original elements as possible. So he kept things like gates and door handles and hate blue beadboard ceilings that we hope are helping ward off the visitors to the Painted Lady that never checked out. There are quite a few ghost stories that are associated with this property. And he also tried to pay homage to the property's former life by naming some of the rooms after former denizens of the area, like Albuquerque's most notorious Madam Lizzie McGrath. He opened the property as the state's first bed and brew in 2018. So instead of offering a bed and breakfast where guests get a free breakfast with their stay every evening, they're able to enjoy a local beer. And so by getting that designation as the state's first bed and brew, he has only continued to add to the historic nature of this property. So the item next up that I want to chat with you about is broken arrows. So broken arrows are incidents involving nuclear weapons that don't lead to the threat of nuclear war. And there have actually been 32 such incidents that have occurred since the first in 1950. The National Museum of Nuclear Science and History actually displays 2 broken arrows, and both of these came from an incident in Palomares, Spain. However, Albuquerque had its own incident of this kind in 1957 involving a Mark 17, which you see here. So our broken arrow occurred at 11:50 a.m. on May 22nd, 1957. A B-36 aircraft was transporting this Mark 17, which is a 10 megaton hydrogen bomb, from Biggs Air Force Base in Texas to Kirtland. And what we think happened is that as it was coming over Albuquerque, the aircraft experienced some turbulence, which many of us who fly in and out of Albuquerque all the time are very familiar with. But the service member, to try to steady himself, he grabbed a handle, and it happened to be the release handle for the bomb bay doors, and he ended up jettisoning the unarmed weapon. So luckily, the plutonium element of the bomb was stored in a separate area of the plane. However, when the Mark 17 was deployed, it did have all of the explosive elements, and so it ended up creating a crater 12 feet deep and 25 feet wide in a luckily uninhabited area of Albuquerque. Those who investigated the scene said that the only casualty was a grazing cow. So I think we should probably count ourselves as lucky that was the only casualty. And this incident was only revealed to the public in the 1980s under the Freedom of Information Act. Of course, in Albuquerque, art goes hand in hand with the cultural identity of our city, and this is one of the artistic gems that I think is often overlooked. So if you're familiar with designer Alexander Girard, you may remember that he was the designer for Herman Miller. He spent decades with them as a textile designer. He also was the designer behind Braniff International Airways brand. So he designed everything for them, from their sugar packets to the way their planes looked. He also designed the Manhattan restaurant La Fonda del Sol and the Compound restaurant here in Santa Fe. But for us New Mexicans, he's perhaps most famous for sharing his extensive folk art collection with what became the International Folk Art Museum in Santa Fe. So his collection actually became the foundational collection for that museum. So all that being said, how did he come to create this mural, or more accurately, mosaic, in the Duke City's first Unitarian church? Well, Gerard was friends and colleagues with Harvey Hochauer, who designed several of Albuquerque's modernist architectural landmarks. So in 1964, he designed the original sanctuary for the First Unitarian Church, and he commissioned his friend and colleague, Alexander Gerard, to create the centerpiece mural. Gerard actually traveled all over northern New Mexico scavenging wood for what became the mosaic. All of the wood features the original stain or paint on it. He didn't color anything. And he used what he found to create 5,000 3-inch blocks to compose the mural. And he installed it in the original sanctuary, and it stretched about 8 feet high and over 40 feet in length. Now in 2013, the congregation actually outgrew its original sanctuary and they built a new one, but they wanted this mural to continue to be a part of their experience. And so block by block, they removed the entire mural and reinstalled it in the new sanctuary. And I love this little story of that the mural actually wasn't complete until the day of the dedication, because they were actually missing one of the blocks. And on the day of the dedication, they happened to open an office drawer somewhere in the church offices, and they discovered the missing block and were able to ceremonially install the last block into the mosaic on that day. The mural honors most of the world's major religions and minor ones too. Of course, you see the Star of David, the Buddhist Dharma wheel, the Islamic Star and Crescent, and many others. And I'll actually go back a slide here so you can see. So Alexander Gerard was actually a Catholic, and so he ended up installing the cross dead center in the mural, and actually set the Unitarian Church's symbol, which is the chalice with the flame you see there, slightly off center. So that was a little bit of his artistic preference coming through. So the next item I want to share with you is the Piedras Marcadas Pueblo. So this is a rare pueblo in the Rio Grande Valley that has escaped excavation and is uninhabited. So of course, we know that many of our pueblos in the Rio Grande Valley are either inhabited and are living communities today, or if they are uninhabited, they've often been excavated archaeologically, and many of the artifacts that were associated with that site, those artistic and historical elements, have been removed. But this is a rare exception to that. And it's really been through a few coincidences of history and geography that it has escaped that excavation. So it actually sits a little bit on higher ground next to some lower, more attractive ground to be plowed for growing crops. And then also it was held as private grazing land for centuries until the city of Albuquerque purchased the land about 30 years ago. And so it escaped being developed and having houses built over the top of it. And Dr. Matthew Schmader, an adjunct anthropology professor at UNM and the former director of the Albuquerque Open Space Division, has actually dedicated decades to preserving and researching this site. And so while it hasn't been excavated, he has been able to use equipment that emits electrical currents to probe down into what lies beneath the surface and to document the site. And so that we know that it was built beginning in the 1300s, and it was a 2 to 3 story building that at its height could have housed several thousand people. And the Spanish's arrival is also documented at the site. Dr. Schmader has found that the placement of arrowheads and musket balls beneath the surface depict a Spanish attack on the Pueblo fortress. He says, no matter how you slice it, this is a place of an intense standoff between the expedition and the Pueblo fighting for survival. And so for information on how to visit that site, you can contact the Open Space Visitor Center, as my agreement with Dr. Schmader in writing about the site is that I not reveal where it is located. So this might be a bit of Albuquerque trivial history that's familiar to some, but many people don't know that actually Albuquerque was the site of Microsoft's first office. When they think of the tech giant, they often think of Seattle, which is a fair assumption. Its founders were from the Seattle area and its offices are located near there today. However, Albuquerque was actually the cradle of personal computing. The story got started with Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen working at Honeywell in Massachusetts. He read an article in Popular Electronics about the Altair 8800, the first microcomputer. And he pitched a basic software program to Micro Instrumentation and Telemetry Systems, which was located here in Albuquerque, who had built the Altair. Now, the company accepted the pitch, but the problem was that Allen didn't actually have the software at that time. So he enlisted the help of his high school friend, Bill Gates, who was attending Harvard at the time. And he convinced Gates to drop out of Harvard and move out to Albuquerque so that they could found Microsoft here in 1975. And they operated out of this office at 115 California Street Northeast. And they also did a fair bit of work out of where they lived nearby in the Sundowner Motel. Now, their time in Albuquerque was fairly short-lived. They relocated to Bellevue in 1979. However, Albuquerque would always remain the birthplace of personal computing. Gates also ran afoul of the law twice while he was in Albuquerque, both for traffic infractions, and he earned his now famous mugshot for running a stop sign and driving without a license in 1977. And another fun detail of the founder's connections to Albuquerque is that Paul Allen loved to go to Duran's Central Pharmacy to eat, including when he came back to visit Albuquerque over the years. And so he was said to enjoy the green chili enchiladas there. So I think that's a great inspiration to go have some green chili enchiladas at Duran's. So a little bit of a connection here with the Sundowner Motel is with the Adopted Signs and Friends of the Orphan Signs project. So by way of background, many motels and businesses along Route 66 have shuttered since the heyday of the Mother Road, and many of their roadside signs have gone derelict along with those businesses. The nonprofit Friends of the Orphan Signs adopts these signs, which they call orphans, and then they bring together professional artists, students, and community members to kind of reimagine what those signs could be as public art pieces. Then they go about refurbishing the signs. Now, this is not a restoration because obviously they look very different than they originally did. But they become new public art pieces. There's one installed at the Sundowner Motel, as I mentioned. There's also a permanent location at Casa Bareilles, formerly the filling station, as well as the Harwood Art Center. Other signs are more ephemeral and changeable. For example, the students at the Media Arts Collaborative Charter School have adopted several signs in front of their campus. And so they'll take on these signs as semester or year-long academic projects. And so the signs change regularly. Those are the ones shown here. And so Friends of the Orphan Signs is a really fascinating project because it makes art much more accessible to the public. It takes it out of the museums and galleries and makes it viewable just as you're driving down the road on the way to work. But be careful when you're driving by so you are aware of traffic as you're viewing these pieces of art. The next item I want to talk a little bit about is Albuquerque's connection to space history. And there are actually many, but this is one that stands out. So before the Mercury 7 were selected to complete the first space flights, they had to undergo rigorous medical testing, and they actually completed those medical tests here in Albuquerque. And William Randolph Randy Lovelace conducted those physicals. So Lovelace had grown up in the Duke City, but he left to attend Harvard Medical School and work at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. He spent time in the Army Medical Reserve, and his passion for flying took him to the Aeromedical Field Laboratory at Wright Medical Base in Dayton, Ohio. He and a team of researchers actually developed a high altitude oxygen mask, which you can see him modeling in that second photo. And he did a lot of work examining the medical problems that high altitude flying introduced. And he often conducted those experiments on himself. In talking with his family, he was quite the daredevil. And so he was never afraid to try out things on himself before he asked the airmen to try them out as well. So the sudden death of two of his sons in 1946 from polio brought his family back to his hometown of Albuquerque, where he began working at his father's Lovelace Clinic. And in 1958, he signed on with the newly created NASA as a medical advisor. And in 1959, the original Mercury Project astronauts came to Albuquerque for a week of medical testing. And my understanding is that they also did a lot of socializing at the Lovelace home in Nob Hill, and that they signed a closet door in one of those rooms. And so wouldn't we all love to know where that closet door ended up? So many people are not aware that there were women who were part of the Mercury Project as well. Lovelace believed that the profile of the perfect astronaut fit women just as well as it did men. And in 1960, 25 women underwent medical testing to become astronauts as well. It didn't seem at all out of place to him, as it did to many of his colleagues. And his niece, Marianne Bunton, said he was surrounded by strong women, his wife and 3 daughters. So he knew that women were tough enough and could handle all that's involved in being an astronaut. NASA ultimately selected 13 women to be astronauts as the Mercury 13, but the project was scuttled the next year before they could take flight. NASA went on to promote Lovelace and name him Director of Space Medicine. However, he only held that position for a year before his untimely death by a plane crash in 1965, which also brought an end to Albuquerque's place as the astronaut medical testing facility. Shifting gears here, I'd like to talk with you a little bit about the Glass Garden. So this is a 3-acre stretch along the Rio Grande Bosque that is carpeted with blue, green, brown, and white glass shards. It's the only evidence that remains of one of the city's early public garbage dumping sites. Residents brought their trash here between 1932 and 1946 when the city of Albuquerque instituted municipal garbage pickup. So most of the trash at this site has either disintegrated or blown away, but the glass still remains. So it's a great spot to go and get outside and kind of reflect on how the sort of protection and preservation of the bosque has changed over the years. It has gone from a dumping site there at Glass Gardens and also at Tingley Beach, which is another former city dump, to one of our most protected areas and respected areas in the city. As you visit the site, you might see dishware, as you can see in this picture, glass containers, and even Clorox bleach bottles. And although some artists will go out to the site to collect pieces of glass for various projects, the site does really feel like an archaeological site. And so I recommend that you leave the pieces of glass there if you do visit. Albuquerque Open Space Forestry Supervisor Matthew Peterson told me, it never made it onto the state historical preservation list, but it is believed to have some historical significance. So as I was preparing to write Secret Albuquerque, I wanted to include as many of the city's museums as possible that I hadn't touched on in 100 Things to Do in Albuquerque Before You Die, and the Maxwell Museum was one of those. So I reached out to them because they have so many amazing artifacts, and I asked about one that had a great story behind it. And this is the one that they shared with me about the Smith family totem. So as we can see here, it's a totem from a Pacific Northwest tribe. So you might be wondering how this totem made its way to the Maxwell Museum and to the Southwest. It's all because of Dr. Frank Hibben, who was a professor at the University of New Mexico and also director of the Maxwell Museum. So he acquired this pole from the Tlu'its First Nation in 1940. The only problem was the night after he collected this item, the tribe reported it missing. So we can say at best he acquired this totem surreptitiously. But because he was director of the Maxwell Museum, it became part of the collection. And this pole was actually carved by renowned artist Charlie James in 1907, and it features the form of a kingfisher, a human, a wolf, a humpback whale, a river otter, a great horned owl, and first man. And when it arrived at the university in the 1940s, it actually was placed outside where it sat in the sun for decades, and that harsh New Mexico sun did its work, fading that beautiful paint. It was moved inside and restored in 1917 by descendants of the original carver, who returned the pole to its former glory and its former bright colors of white, black, red, and little tinges of yellow there. And in 2017, the university also returned the pole's title to the Tlu'its Nation, and in particular the Smith family, because it is the hereditary crest pole of the Chief Daniel Smith, who also gave permission for me to share with you images of the family crest pole. So the university and the nation developed a 30-year repository agreement. So while ownership resides with the tribe, the university does have the right to display the totem for the next 30 years. So next I wanted to share with you about the gratitude train boxcars. So as a native Albuquerquean, these were items that I had walked by a million times going to the state fairgrounds and had always wondered about the story behind them. So there are two actually boxcars, 240 and 8 boxcars connected to the gratitude train at Expo, New Mexico. So if you aren't familiar, the gratitude train actually came in response to the 1947 friendship train, in which the United States sent aid to France after World War II. A couple years later, France responded in kind with a gratitude train, sending 48 of these boxcars plus to the continental states as well as Washington, D.C., filled with various items that were gifts to show their appreciation to the United States for their assistance during World War II. So New Mexico's gratitude train boxcar arrived in Santa Fe in February 1949, and the gifts were distributed to various libraries and museums and colleges across the state. However, the boxcar itself eventually ended up at the state fairgrounds in Albuquerque, where it again sat outside in the weather for many years and definitely faded, and you can see that original boxcar in this image. So a member of the 48 Boxcar Society discovered the car in a state of disrepair in 1981 and set about with a committee of volunteers locating a similar boxcar, one dating to 1903, and restoring it to look as though the original boxcar did when it arrived in New Mexico in 1949. And so you can see here that it bears the emblem of all the French provinces and has a much more striking appearance than that first boxcar. So New Mexico became the only state with 2 such boxcars with connections to the gratitude train. And both the original and the replica are still at Expo, New Mexico, but as you can see, they're stored under a shelter to protect them from that harsh New Mexico sun. So while that New Mexico sun isn't good for boxcars, it's certainly good for solar power. And Albuquerque is actually home to the world's first active solar heated commercial building. Today, the building is unoccupied and largely incognito, but it is famous nevertheless. So Albuquerque architectural firm Stanley and Wright designed this building in 1965 as the offices of Bridgers and Paxton engineering firm. And the firm built the solar heating system that made the building so newsworthy. It had collector panels, 750 of them stretching across the roof. They're now covered up with the green metal roofing that you can see here. The building also had a water storage tank and a heat pump. So the way the system worked was that water was pumped through the panes in tubes. Of course, it heated up in the sun, and then it was stored in the water tank at temperature and then pumped throughout the building to help heat up the building. And Life magazine published an article about the building which legitimized the structure as a symbol of innovation, but the article did remark that it was an odd-looking new office building. So apparently Life magazine wasn't too impressed. However, the building did become part of the New Mexico State Register of Cultural Properties in 1985, recognizing its importance. Other remnants of Albuquerque's modernist architecture lie in the Dale Bellema homes. So Albuquerque is, of course, generally thought of to be a land of adobe or adobe style buildings, perhaps a few Victorian structures, but not really a location for modernist architecture, but it is nonetheless. So Dale Bellema, who's the son of a Lebanese immigrant, helped build the American dream for families looking for that picture-perfect life post-World War II. He was determined to provide homes for the everyman at an affordable price. And so he started in 1954, building a new development on Princess Jean Park. So all the homes kind of center around that area. And the development ultimately came to include 1,600 homes that captured a very Disney-esque life fantasy with storybook ranch homes. So the ranch homes, some of them have exaggerated roofs that are in a butterfly style, so they dip in the middle and then come up at the edges like wings. Other homes have cedar shingles that are definitely not typical of Albuquerque, or they are finished with scalloped barge boards, so they look like gingerbread homes, and a few homes even have wishing wells out front. Bellema also imagined the homes and advertised the homes as, quote, wife-planned homes, and advertisements promised that the houses would free the wives from the drudgery of housework by giving them modern appliances, such as washing machines, refrigerators, and in-sink garbage disposals. So of course we can't see all those details, but they're there. And we can see those exterior architectural details. And the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History featured the homes in a 1994 exhibition titled Science in American Life because of those inclusion of modern appliances and the vision for a new wife-planned home. So the De Anza Motor Lodge, it has been an important Route 66 icon in Albuquerque, and it's gotten a new life, which has sort of begged the question of whether an important mural by Tony Edeke is still part of the property. So I wanted to share a little bit about that. So Zuni art was integral to the De Anza Motor Lodge in its first life, and it certainly remains so today. Zuni trader C.G. Wallace originally built the Motor Lodge along Route 66 in 1939, and as tourism grew, he expanded the tourist court hotel from 30 rooms to 67 rooms and added the Turquoise Cafe, where the floor is still inlay with little chips of the blue gemstones even today. The De Anza was also featured in the Green Book, which of course invited Black travelers to friendly hotels and restaurants in the Jim Crow era so that they knew that they could travel there safely. Wallace also commissioned Zuni artist Tony Edeke to paint a series of murals inside the trading post, which was also part of the property. Edeke did so, depicting the Shalico, a series of dances that are very important to the Zuni people. The lodge fell into disrepair after Wallace's death in 1993. And although the city of Albuquerque purchased the property and landed it a spot on the National Register of Historic Places in 2004, there was some question as to whether the murals were being maintained or were still there. And it was actually 13 more years until developers purchased the property with the goal of reestablishing the Route 66 icon. So they've done that, and they've reimagined it as a multi-purpose property that has luxury apartment buildings, office spaces, and they hope soon a tenant in the Turquoise Cafe. They also restored the iconic sign and have kept many of the original details as they can throughout the mixed-use development, even if they're repurposed in a slightly different way. They've also preserved, with near museum quality efforts, the Etiquette murals. They installed proper ventilation and lighting and fire suppression to keep the murals safe. And they're currently working with members of the Zuni Pueblo to talk about the proper ways that the public can go and visit and experience those murals so that they can learn about not only the murals, but the ceremony that the murals depict as well. The developers have also commissioned Etiquette's grandson, Keith, to paint a mural on the exterior of the building so that anyone from the public can experience Etiquette family murals. However, that is still in process and has been slightly delayed due to COVID-19. Another area of the city of Albuquerque that I'd like to talk about is the East End Addition. So this is actually Albuquerque's first Black suburb. Homesteader Henry Outley was given 160 acres of land near what is today Lomas and Wyoming in Albuquerque. He was a member of the Fraternal Aid Society, which was a prominent group of Black businessmen, and he partnered with them on endeavors such as the Booker T. Washington Sanatorium on Arno Street. He really believed in the suburban lifestyle and had this belief also that the city of Albuquerque would continue to expand eastward, which of course was very prescient for the time. In 1938, Outley had 144 acres of his homestead platted into a subdivision that he called the East End Addition. Now, given that it was 1938, however, many of the deeds for Albuquerque houses were redlined, meaning that it was written into the deed that a Black person could not purchase that property. And so it was impossible for a Black developer, even with someone of Outley's business standing in the community, to get a loan to build the homes. So he sold and perhaps even gave away several pieces of land, and ultimately he deeded the remaining acres to his daughter, Virginia Glover Outley Ballou, in 1944. So you can see Outley and his daughter, the young woman, Virginia, here. Virginia followed in her father's footsteps and became an entrepreneur as well. She owned Brenda's Barbecue on Arno, which catered to the households of Ben Abruzzo and William Lovelace, to name just two. And in the 1940s, as GIs were returning home from World War II, the Black GIs were being prohibited from using their GI Bill loans to purchase new housing because of those redlining laws. And so that spurred Virginia to revisit her father's dream. Albuquerque builders would work with her, so she reached out to J.S. Jones, a Black architect and builder in Phoenix, who agreed to sign on to the project. And ultimately, somewhere between 18 and 30 homes were constructed in the neighborhood, certainly fewer than Outley had originally envisioned, but nevertheless an important stake in the ground in establishing a Black suburb in Albuquerque. Another historic property that I wanted to visit with you about is the Nexus Brewery and Smokehouse on Broadway. So the popular restaurant is actually housed in a historic building. In the 1950s, when Jim Crow era laws kept Black Albuquerque residents from socializing in other clubs in the city, they could go to the Navajo Elk Lodge to socialize and have parties. Now, the name the Navajo Elk Lodge has more to do with the place than the people. It's actually a predominantly Black membership, but they would hold potlucks on Friday and Saturday nights that were open to anyone that wanted to come and enjoy them. And I was actually able to talk with Johnny Goodwin, who DJ'd for those gatherings starting in 1975 when he became an Elks member. until for about 30 years until 2016, when the Elks moved out of this building into a different location when they were no longer able to kind of care for that property. So after they moved out, businessman Ken Carson purchased the property. He's a former banker who had left his corporate life to start up the New Mexican soul food restaurant and brewery Nexus. And so he purchased this as another location for his business. He wanted to keep it as a gathering place for the South Broadway neighborhood, which is a historically Black area of the city of Albuquerque, and really wanted to keep that neighborhood feel by employing several people from the area, including Mr. Goodwin. So just to prove that Albuquerque is always growing and expanding, I wanted to touch on the Center of the City Centennial Project. It's a City of Albuquerque public art project that marks the center of the city from Albuquerque in 1912, when New Mexico became a state, and a century later in 2012. So in the run-up to New Mexico's centennial, they were trying to discover where the center of New Mexico was. And so inspired by that, one of Albuquerque's surveyors, Cliff Wilkie, wanted to discover where the center of Albuquerque was. And so he did, and he marked it with a piece of duct tape, which didn't feel very official at the time. So Sherry Brugman, who is the head of Albuquerque Public Art, suggested that there should be a pair of markers from the years I just mentioned to kind of track the development of the city. So they surveyed both those locations, and Yamilet Duarte, the artist, created this pair of markers, which do look a bit like manhole covers, but they're the most beautiful set of manhole covers that you've ever seen. Around the outside of the circle, they have ticking like a compass, and they're actually reliefs of each other. So where one is recessed, the other projects. And they're laid in two different spots in the city. The one from 1912, seen here, is in front of Amyville High School, which kind of divides the difference between Old Town and New Town at the time, and the other is at Coronado Park, 1.8 miles north, which definitely represents the city's westward expansion and reminds us all that Albuquerque is always growing and expanding and changing. So those are all the items from Secret Albuquerque that I wanted to share with you today. The book is available wherever books are sold, but of course we like to support our local bookstores like Bookworks, Page One, Treasure House Books, and Organic Books. You can also find the book on my website at ashleyandbiggers.com/shop. And if you do happen to pick up the book, I would love if you would leave me a review on Goodreads or Amazon, because it helps other people find the book. I'd also like to invite you to join me on Facebook or Instagram, whatever your social media of choice is, at ABQ Guide, as I share things from Secret Albuquerque, as well as 100 things to do in Albuquerque before you die, and just anything else that's happening in the city that may be of note and of interest. So as I get to the end of my presentation, I will just stop sharing my screen with you so that I can turn my attention to any questions that you may have. So Dan Schaefer has asked, will this presentation be available for viewing in the future? Yes, Dan, this will be archived both on Facebook, so you can access it there, and it will also be available on the Albuquerque Historical Society website, where you can view it, as well as the archived presentations from all of their monthly meetings going back some time. So that's a great resource if you want to really dive into more of Albuquerque's history. Just looking down the list. So a few people are commenting that they loved the 100 Things book. That's from Patricia Milner. Patricia, thank you so much for that compliment. I hope you enjoy Secret Albuquerque as well. And Janet commented, thank you for clarifying the legal ownership of the totem. Yes, that was very important, both to the university and of course to the tribe, to make that different ownership agreement. And I was very pleased to see that kind of arrangement taking shape. Thank you all so much for the comments from Laura about the wonderful presentation. I certainly appreciate that. As a native Albuquerquean, I really enjoyed researching Secret Albuquerque because given that I grew up here, given that I had written 100 things to do in Albuquerque before you die, and that I have dedicated much of my journalistic writing to writing about Albuquerque, it surprised me how many things there were that I could still discover and learn about in the Duke City. It was a delightful surprise, and my favorite part of this book writing process was learning all of the new things about Albuquerque that I discovered during the writing and researching process. So one of the other items that I kind of discovered through the process of writing this book was also about the press club, which I had always, one of those places that I had always driven by my entire life in Albuquerque and wondered why there was a log cabin on a hill in the middle of downtown Albuquerque. And so writing Secret Albuquerque gave me a great excuse to be able to go and research and discover why places like that existed. And so an important part of this book was definitely revealing the hidden histories and kind of the stories behind those landmarks that we pass all of the time here in Albuquerque, and we don't question. Janet is saying to mention that some of those storybook houses are near Constitution and Eubank. Yes, so because it includes 1,600 houses, it was difficult to kind of give people a great way to explore the neighborhood. So if you start at Princess Jean Park, that's kind of the center of the neighborhood, and you can just sort of drive in circles around there to see all of the architecture of the Dale Bellama homes that are in that area. Some have been very well preserved. Some have lost all of their original architectural details, but it's kind of fun to try to spot those Storybook Ranch home details as well. All of the items, Catherine Cordova is asking, where did Bellama advertise? The advertisements that I've seen have been from just local newspapers at the time. I don't know if he advertised beyond Albuquerque and kind of spread the word about these wife planned homes beyond that. I'm just taking a look at more questions. Adric Menning, I'm not sure I understand your comment, if you want to share more about that. Adric is noting, do I know anything about the historic houses all having fake birdhouses in the Constitution, Arizona area? I didn't know about that. That was a detail that I didn't know about. One thing that I do know is that another marker of the Dale Bellama homes is the logo of a bell. And so if you're looking for whether it's a Dale Bellama neighborhood, you can take a stroll around, and often those that symbol will be marked into the sidewalks of those areas. Yes, Paula Donahue is noting that there's about 1 block left of the East End neighborhood, and she viewed them while waiting for her car at Garcia Honda. Yes, if you're waiting at Garcia Honda, you can just hop next door and take a look at the East End neighborhood, because you're right, it is just right there. And there has been efforts within the community and within that neighborhood to try to do more restoration work and more preservation work and just acknowledgement of that neighborhood. So there is a sign that kind of marks the start to the neighborhood, but they haven't been successful at this point in doing all of the preservation that they would like to do for that area of the city. there are any further questions, you can sneak those in. Well, just as a reminder, if you're not a usual attendee to the Albuquerque Historical Society meetings, they often have them on a monthly basis. COVID is giving us all a bit of our run for our money in that respect, but there's many meetings that you might find of interest. So you can always head to the Albuquerque Historical Society website to find out more information and to catch up on previous meetings. And since there are no further questions at this time, I will sign off for today. But thank you so much for joining me and spending a little time this afternoon to talk about Secret Albuquerque. Again, it's available wherever books are sold. And more than anything, whether you grab the book or not, I hope you can remember to create that sense of discovery and to travel within Albuquerque and rediscover your hometown all the time. Thank you so much for having me.